May 1945, deep in the Austrian Alps, silence hung heavy after 6 long years of chaos. The snow was melting, trickling through the cracks of bomb-scarred rock, while the thunder of war faded into memory. On a narrow mountain road outside Reutte, a small convoy of U.S. Army jeeps came to a halt. The air was sharp with the scent of oil, gunmetal, and the last smoke of burned villages. Ahead, a group of German men stood with their hands raised. Scientists, not soldiers. Their uniforms were dirty, their faces hollow with exhaustion. One of them, tall and pale, carried his right arm in a sling and clutched a weather-worn notebook filled with rocket diagrams. His name was Wernher von Braun. Behind the Americans, trucks waited, loaded with mysterious crates, stenciled V2. No one in that moment could grasp the scale of what they had just found, the culmination of Nazi Germany's secret weapons program, and the seeds of humanity's future in space. The officers didn't yet know it, but what started as the surrender of a few weary engineers would soon become one of the most controversial scientific migrations in history, Operation Paperclip. What began on this cold mountain road would echo all the way to the deserts of New Mexico, and decades later, to the surface of the moon. By the beginning of 1943, the tide of World War II was turning sharply against Nazi Germany. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority. The Allies were bombing cities and factories with increasing precision, and the Eastern Front had become a brutal war of attrition. Yet deep inside the Third Reich, a secret scientific race was underway, one that Hitler believed could change the outcome of the war. In a remote facility on the Baltic island of Usedom, near the small fishing village of Peenemünde, German scientists under the leadership of Wernher von Braun and General Walter Dornberger were developing a weapon unlike anything seen before, the V2 rocket. It was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, capable of traveling faster than the speed of sound and delivering explosives across national borders without warning. Peenemünde became a symbol of Nazi Germany's obsession with technological supremacy. Thousands of engineers, technicians, and forced laborers worked around the clock in laboratories and assembly halls, pushing the limits of physics, metallurgy, and propulsion. But as the Allies intensified their bombing campaigns, the facility became a target. On the night of August 17, 1943, a massive Royal Air Force raid known as Operation Hydra struck Peenemünde, killing hundreds and forcing the German High Command to relocate the project underground. Production was moved to a hidden network of tunnels carved into the Harz Mountains, known as the Mittelwerk, near the town of Nordhausen. There, under appalling conditions, tens of thousands of prisoners from Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp labored to build the V2s, many dying from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. While German scientists were perfecting their rockets, Allied intelligence agencies were already preparing for the next phase of the war, not just to defeat Germany, but to capture its scientific secrets. Units like the T-Forces and the Alsos mission were assigned to locate, secure, and interrogate enemy scientists, laboratories, and research archives before the Soviets could reach them. As the Reich crumbled in 1945, the Allies realized that victory on the battlefield was only the beginning of a new kind of conflict, one that would be fought with data, formulas, and intellect. It was no longer a race for territory, it was a race for brains. In the final months of the war, Germany's scientific elites scattered. Some fled west, hoping to surrender to the Americans or British rather than fall into Soviet hands. Others hid in small alpine towns or destroyed their research to avoid capture. Yet the Allies were ready. They had lists, secret compilations of names and expertise, like the Osenberg list, which cataloged thousands of German scientists working on advanced weaponry. American teams moved rapidly through collapsing German territory, guided by intelligence reports and informants, hunting for men who had once built Hitler's weapons but now could build America's future. In April 1945, as U.S. and Soviet forces closed in from opposite directions, time became the critical variable. The Soviets were advancing toward central Germany, home to the rocket assembly plants and test ranges. The Americans pushed deeper into Bavaria and Thuringia, where many of the Peenemünde engineers had taken refuge. It was there, in this narrow strip of land between two armies, that the race for German science reached its fevered peak. As German industry fell into Allied hands, it became clear that this was no ordinary spoils of war. The documents, blueprints, and equipment represented a leap in technology that could redefine the post-war balance of power. Jet propulsion, rocketry, aerodynamics, chemistry, and even medicine all had been advanced under Nazi rule, often through horrific means. Yet behind every piece of hardware was a human mind, and those minds were now the most valuable currency in the world. The war was ending, but a new competition was already beginning, one that would reshape the modern era. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the world celebrated the end of tyranny. But beneath the victory parades and the flags, another battle had already begun, one waged in secrecy, fought not with tanks or rifles, but with dossiers, aircraft manifests, and coded telegrams. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union each understood that whoever controlled the minds of Germany's top scientists would control the future. These scientists had spent the war pushing the frontiers of rocketry, chemistry, aerodynamics, and medicine, fields that could now determine who would rule the skies, the atom, and even space itself. Within days of Germany's surrender, American military intelligence initiated Operation Overcast, a classified program designed to locate and evaluate Nazi scientists for possible relocation to the United States. Officially, its purpose was to interrogate experts and prevent their knowledge from aiding America's future enemies. Unofficially, it was something far larger, the first stage of an organized transfer of German scientific talent to America, regardless of ideology. The program's name would soon change to a more enduring one, Operation Paperclip, named for the paperclips attached to dossiers of candidates whose Nazi records were being quietly sanitized. The U.S. Army's Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, led the effort, working under orders from the War Department. Truman's administration initially insisted that no ardent Nazis or war criminals be recruited, but the practical realities of the Cold War erased moral boundaries. Background checks were altered, biographies rewritten, and entire records redacted. Engineers, doctors, and physicists who had once served the Third Reich were now labeled as specialists vital to national security. The American military establishment understood that these men possessed skills decades ahead of their time: jet engines, long-range missiles, nerve agents, synthetic fuels. Every discovery held the potential to define the next century's warfare. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was conducting its own campaign, equally ambitious and ruthless. Soviet trophy brigades swept across occupied Germany, dismantling factories, confiscating archives, and rounding up scientists. In October 1946, under the massive operation known as Ossoaviakim, more than 2,200 German specialists and their families were forcibly relocated to the Soviet Union. They were sent to isolated research centers, working under armed guard on missile programs that would later evolve into the R-1 and R-7 rockets, the same lineage that would put Sputnik into orbit a decade later. For the Americans, the most valuable catch lay in the collapsing heart of Germany's rocket empire, Nordhausen and the Harz region, where the Mittelwerk had produced thousands of V-2 rockets under appalling slave labor conditions. Allied reconnaissance revealed caches of disassembled rockets, test stands, and hundreds of tons of technical documents hidden in tunnels. U.S. units moved swiftly, taking control of Bleicherode, Dora, and surrounding towns. Among the captives were the very men who had led the V-2 program: Wernher von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, Hermann Oberth, and dozens of their key engineers. Von Braun and his team, aware of the Soviets' proximity, made a calculated decision: surrender to the Americans. On May 2, 1945, carrying boxes of technical reports and design sketches, they turned themselves in to a U.S. Army intelligence unit. Their surrender was both pragmatic and symbolic. The knowledge that had once powered Hitler's vengeance weapons would now power America's military and, eventually, its dreams of space exploration. As the captured scientists were quietly relocated to interrogation centers and then to holding camps, the full scale of their expertise became apparent. The Americans realized they had acquired not only data, but a fully formed technological foundation. The V-2 rocket was unlike anything the Allies had built. It used liquid fuel, gyroscopic guidance, and complex turbopumps that demonstrated an understanding of aeronautics far beyond Allied standards. The transfer of these men and their research to the United States began almost immediately. Through 1946 and 1947, hundreds of German specialists were transported under the Paperclip banner, first to Fort Strong in Massachusetts, and later to Fort Bliss, Texas, and the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. There, under military supervision, they reconstructed V-2 rockets from captured parts and began test launches that would lay the groundwork for America's ballistic missile and space programs. But the secrecy of Paperclip came with a moral price. Many of the scientists had worked directly with or overseen forced labor in underground camps. Their wartime actions were blurred under the urgency of Cold War rivalry. In official briefings, references to concentration camps were removed, affiliations rewritten, and oaths of loyalty ignored. The narrative of scientific necessity overrode the ethical debate. America had not just captured the enemy's knowledge, it had absorbed it. The Second World War was over, but its most dangerous race had only just begun. The silent struggle for supremacy between the superpowers, fueled by the minds once loyal to Hitler. What had started as an intelligence operation was rapidly transforming into a global technological arms race. The battlefield had shifted, from ruined European cities to laboratories, test stands, and launch pads. The human side of Operation Paperclip was far from simple. For the scientists who had lived through the collapse of the Reich, surrender was not only a bid for survival, but also a moral gamble. Many had worked under constant fear of the SS, of political reprisal, of being labeled defeatist. Wernher von Braun himself had been arrested by the Gestapo in 1944 for expressing doubts about Germany's chances of winning the war. Yet his release came quickly because his expertise was too valuable to lose. When the Americans arrived, these men faced a haunting contradiction: the chance to begin again, or the guilt of the world they had served. Most chose cooperation, seeing in America both protection and opportunity. But for survivors of Mittelbau-Dora, the prisoners who had built the rockets, the news that their former tormentors were being given new lives in the West felt like a deep betrayal. For them, the scientific triumphs to come would always carry the shadow of the tunnels where thousands had perished. From a tactical perspective, Paperclip was an intelligence victory executed with precision and secrecy. The U.S. Army recognized that the Soviets were advancing faster than anyone had anticipated. American officers on the ground received orders to secure German scientists before the Red Army reached them, often crossing into zones that were supposed to belong to the Soviets after the war. Trucks loaded with technical documents, components, and personnel moved south through the night under false manifests. The U.S. command justified the urgency with a simple truth: knowledge could not be divided by borders. The first transports of engineers and families were disguised as technical consultants being evacuated for debriefing. Every successful capture, every secured laboratory, meant another advantage in the looming Cold War. While much of Europe still burned, America was already collecting the spoils of intelligence that would define the next century's wars, not in trenches but in laboratories. Technologically, what the United States inherited from Germany was staggering. The V-2 rocket, though a weapon of terror, was the blueprint for a new era of propulsion and guidance. Its gyroscopic stabilization, advanced fuel systems, and engine design were decades ahead of anything produced in the Allied world. Engineers at White Sands would later remark that they were studying machines built by ghosts, so far beyond their own understanding that they felt like artifacts from another civilization. German aeronautical data on swept wings, supersonic flow, and high-altitude pressure dynamics would soon influence American jet aircraft such as the Bell X-1 and the early generation of supersonic bombers. In the laboratories of Huntsville and Fort Bliss, German and American teams began testing rocket motors side by side, translating equations, and turning instruments meant for war into tools for exploration. These three dimensions, human, tactical, and technological, formed the spine of Paperclip's transformation. What had been conceived as a short-term interrogation mission evolved into a permanent scientific migration. The human moral conflict intertwined with strategic necessity, while the technology itself opened new realms of possibility. America was no longer merely winning a war. It was inheriting an empire of knowledge built on both genius and cruelty. And as both nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, armed themselves with that knowledge, a new front was being drawn across the post-war world, invisible yet far more dangerous than any battlefield. At the leadership level, Operation Paperclip was driven by both ambition and unease. Within the American military, opinions were divided. President Harry S. Truman had initially set strict conditions. No individuals who had been active supporters of Nazi militarism were to be brought to the United States. But by the time the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency began its full-scale operations, these lines had blurred beyond recognition. Senior figures within the U.S. Army, such as General Holger Toftoy and Colonel Donald Putt, argued that national security outweighed moral considerations. They believed that if the United States hesitated, the Soviet Union would gain an irreversible technological advantage. To them, the choice was stark. Either harness the expertise of men like von Braun, or risk watching Moscow launch the world's first long-range missile. Under their watch, dossiers were quietly edited, Nazi affiliations minimized, and questionable pasts erased. Paperclip was, in many ways, a product of leadership willing to compromise ethics for progress, and of a system too caught up in the new geopolitical reality to look back. The moral dimension of Operation Paperclip remains one of the most debated legacies of the 20th century. On paper, it was a scientific success. In spirit, it was a moral wound. The very same individuals who had designed weapons for a regime responsible for the Holocaust were now being celebrated as pioneers of Western innovation. In the official briefings, their pasts were described as circumstantial or non-political. Yet documents later uncovered showed that many had been fully complicit in the Nazi war machine. Some had overseen forced labor. Others had conducted experiments that blurred the boundary between research and atrocity. Still, in the feverish climate of early Cold War paranoia, these details were seen as inconvenient obstacles. The justification was repeated often. The war was over, but the world was still in danger, and science was too valuable to waste on punishment. This uneasy trade-off between morality and progress became a defining feature of post-war American science. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet response followed a similar logic, though cloaked in greater secrecy. Under Sergei Korolev, the Soviets rebuilt captured V-2s from remnants collected in Germany and from the expertise of German engineers forcibly relocated east. Their laboratories near Moscow, Kaliningrad, and Dnipropetrovsk became the birthplaces of the early Soviet missile program. By 1950, while most German specialists in the USSR were being repatriated, the Soviets had already absorbed their methods, data, and insights into their own indigenous programs. The R-1, an almost direct copy of the V-2, marked the foundation for what would later become the R-7 Semyorka, the rocket that launched Sputnik in 1957. The Soviets' version of Paperclip, though less publicized, mirrored the same philosophy. The moral past of science could be overlooked, as long as its future served the state. These interconnected angles, leadership pragmatism, moral compromise, and the mirrored actions of two emerging superpowers, transformed the aftermath of World War II into something far more complex than a victory. It was not merely about who had won the war, but who would control the future. Science became the new battlefield, and the scientists themselves became its soldiers, traded and transported like strategic assets. The world was dividing into two camps, both born from the same soil of German innovation. From the ruins of Peenemünde and the tunnels of Dora, two rockets would rise, one carrying an American flag to the moon, the other lifting a Soviet satellite into space. The war for the Earth had ended, but the race for the heavens had just begun. The turning point came not on a battlefield, but in the chaos of surrender, amid burned forests, crumbling roads, and the uncertain silence of a defeated empire. In late April and early May of 1945, the V-2 program's surviving engineers made their final move. As Allied troops advanced into Thuringia and the Soviet Third Army closed from the east, Wernher von Braun and his team faced an impossible choice: be captured by the Soviets or surrender to the Americans. They knew precisely what was at stake. Their knowledge could shape the post-war order, and whoever claimed them would inherit the power to reach beyond the stratosphere. Von Braun, his arm still in a cast from a car accident, made the fateful decision to head west. Carrying crates filled with blueprints, research notes, and technical drawings, the engineers hid them in an abandoned mine near Dürnten, hoping they could negotiate their way to safety. On May 2, 1945, the first contact was made. Von Braun's brother, Magnus von Braun, rode a bicycle to locate advancing U.S. forces and encountered troops from the 44th Infantry Division near Reute, Austria. Within hours, an arrangement was made. The German rocket scientists would surrender voluntarily to the Americans in exchange for protection from Soviet capture. It was a moment of staggering historical consequence. The weapons that had once rained terror on London and Antwerp were now bargaining chips for the future of mankind. As the engineers were escorted to American command posts, the U.S. Army quickly realized what had fallen into its hands. Not only men, but the technological core of Germany's most advanced research. The same day, American officers began securing key sites: the Mittelwerk tunnels, the Bleicher Road laboratories, and the Nordhausen archives. Each site yielded a treasure trove of intelligence: rocket components, gyroscopic guidance units, and over 100 tons of documents. In the weeks that followed, a covert logistical operation unfolded across the shattered landscape of Germany. Under codenames like Project Hermes and Special Mission V2, the U.S. Army began transporting captured hardware and personnel out of the European theater. Hundreds of disassembled V2 rockets, engines, and test stands were shipped to the port of Antwerp, and then across the Atlantic to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. The first wave of German engineers, including von Braun and Arthur Rudolph, was flown to Fort Bliss, Texas, in September 1945. There, behind layers of military secrecy, they were introduced to their American counterparts, engineers, officers, and scientists eager to learn from the men who had built the world's first ballistic missile. At White Sands, a new era began. The desert air was dry and clear, the perfect canvas for experimentation. Using parts recovered from Mittelwerk and the Nordhausen stores, the joint German-American team began reconstructing V-2 rockets. The first test launches in 1946 were fraught with failures. Rockets veered off course, exploded mid-air, or disintegrated upon launch. Yet each test brought valuable data. The engineers worked tirelessly, improving guidance systems, studying exhaust trails, and refining telemetry. The same rocket that had once served as a weapon of destruction was now a scientific instrument, paving the way for upper atmosphere research and early spaceflight. The Americans were astonished by the precision of German engineering. The V-2's propulsion system using liquid oxygen and ethanol was decades ahead of U.S. technology. Its design principles became the foundation for future American missile programs: Redstone, Jupiter, and ultimately Saturn. What had begun as a desperate wartime surrender was rapidly transforming into a symbiotic partnership. German expertise merged with American resources, and the result was technological acceleration on an unprecedented scale. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviets were racing to catch up. Their own teams had captured remnants of the V-2 program in eastern Germany, but lacked the key personnel who had surrendered to the Americans. They rebuilt what they could, copying blueprints and reverse engineering components. But it was clear, The United States had won the first battle of the post-war scientific race. The Cold War had not yet been declared, but its opening shots had already been fired in laboratories, not on front lines. In less than a year, Operation Paperclip had evolved from a secret transfer program into the cornerstone of America's technological dominance. By 1946, von Braun's team had launched dozens of reconstructed V-2s at White Sands, each flight yielding new data on atmosphere, temperature, and propulsion. What had once been a Nazi superweapon was now carrying cosmic ray detectors and cameras, capturing the first photographs of Earth from space. The transformation was both breathtaking and troubling. A weapon reborn as a symbol of progress, powered by the same minds who had once served a regime of terror. The world was entering a new era of competition, one not marked by armies or empires, but by the reach of its rockets. The lessons of Peenemünde had not been lost, only repurposed. The stage was now set for the next decisive leap, the moment when rockets would leave the battlefield behind and aim for the heavens. By the mid-1950s, the seeds planted in the deserts of New Mexico had begun to bear fruit. Operation Paperclip's quiet experiment had transformed into a fully operational engine of innovation within the American military-industrial complex. At Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, Wernher von Braun and his German team were now working under the supervision of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. What had once been a small group of captured engineers had evolved into a thriving scientific community. Hundreds of specialists, translators, and technicians refining the technology that had been born in the ruins of Nazi Germany. The V-2 had become the Redstone rocket, longer, more powerful, and more precise, its purpose now redefined for America's Cold War strategy. The same engineering principles that once struck London now promised to defend Washington. Yet the world changed faster than even these engineers could imagine. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. The metallic sphere, no larger than a beach ball, sent a simple signal that reverberated like thunder through the Western world. The United States, confident in its technological lead, suddenly realized it had been overtaken. The shock of Sputnik shattered complacency. In homes, classrooms, and newsrooms, Americans looked upward and felt a mixture of awe and fear. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could just as easily launch a nuclear warhead. The balance of power had tilted overnight, and at the center of the American response stood the same man who had once built rockets for Hitler's war machine, Wernher von Braun. Within weeks, the Pentagon turned to von Braun's team. They had been working on the Jupiter C, a modified Redstone missile capable of reaching the upper atmosphere. In the wake of Sputnik, political hesitation vanished. Every moral debate that had shadowed Paperclip was swept aside by urgency. The order was simple: build a rocket that could restore American pride. On January 31, 1958, under a cold Florida night sky, Explorer 1 roared upward from Cape Canaveral. As the rocket pierced the clouds, carrying instruments designed to study cosmic rays, the men at the launch site held their breath. Moments later, radio signals confirmed orbit. The United States had entered space. The emotional contrast could not have been sharper. Barely 13 years earlier, the same minds had been hiding in mountain tunnels, building weapons for a collapsing Reich. Now they were standing in white laboratory coats, surrounded by U.S. flags, as cameras flashed and newspapers hailed them as heroes of the free world. Von Braun, once a reluctant prisoner, was now an American citizen. His German accent echoed in congressional hearings as he spoke about the dream of space exploration. To many, he was the symbol of scientific redemption, proof that genius could transcend ideology. To others, his rise represented something darker, a moral bargain the world had chosen to forget. The launch of Explorer 1 did more than restore national confidence. It changed the direction of human history. Within months, the U.S. government consolidated its civilian and military space efforts into a new agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, established on July 29, 1958. Von Braun's team was transferred under its authority, their laboratories at Huntsville, repurposed for the development of the Saturn, rockets that would one day carry astronauts to the moon. The very engineers who had once designed missiles for the Nazi regime were now central to America's boldest dream, the conquest of space. But beneath the triumph lay the unspoken truth of Paperclip, the moral cost of progress. The Cold War had erased distinctions between justice and utility. America's new scientific supremacy was built on a foundation of compromise, on the decision that some truths were better buried than confronted. While von Braun smiled for television cameras, survivors of Mittelbaudora still lived with scars that no apology could erase. Their memories of forced labor, starvation, and death were stark reminders that technology could never be separated from its origins. Still, history moved forward, unstoppable and unsentimental. The space age had begun, and it carried with it the paradox born in 1945 that the pursuit of knowledge can lift humanity to the stars, even when its roots lie in the darkest corners of war. From Peenemunde's wind-swept shores to the deserts of New Mexico and the launch pads of Florida, one unbroken line connected them all, a line drawn not by ideology, but by invention. The same flame that once fueled destruction now illuminated the path to exploration. The world had witnessed the transformation of science from a weapon of annihilation into a tool of wonder. But the question remained, could humanity ever truly separate the brilliance of the mind from the burden of its conscience? The answer, as the rockets climbed higher into the sky, was still uncertain. By the early 1960s, Operation Paperclip had fully reshaped the scientific and military landscape of the United States. What had begun as a secret wartime intelligence mission had become the foundation of America's missile defense and space programs. At Redstone Arsenal and later at the Marshall Space Flight Center, Wernher von Braun's team developed an unbroken chain of rocket designs that would lead from the V-2 to the Saturn V, the most powerful launch vehicle ever built. The irony was striking. Technology once designed to destroy London would now carry humanity to the moon. Under von Braun's leadership, the Redstone missile evolved into the Jupiter, and then into the Saturn I, a rocket of immense power and precision. These designs laid the groundwork for NASA's Apollo program, which would define a generation and cement America's dominance in space exploration. The immediate benefits of Paperclip were not limited to rocketry. German aerodynamicists, chemists, and physicians integrated into American institutions, contributing to advancements that stretched across multiple sectors. In aviation, scientists such as Alexander Lippisch, the designer of the Me-163 Comet, advanced delta-wing and supersonic flight research. In medicine, specialists in aviation physiology and trauma research joined U.S. Air Force laboratories, bringing data derived from wartime experiments, some of it ethically controversial, that accelerated understanding of hypothermia, decompression, and high-altitude flight. Metallurgists introduced innovations in alloys and turbine technology that transformed American jet engines. The United States had not merely absorbed talent, it had absorbed an entire ecosystem of scientific methodology, documentation, and problem-solving culture honed under the intense pressures of total war. By 1961, the Cold War's technological rivalry had reached a fever pitch. The Soviet Union's Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, and once again the United States found itself trailing in the race it had helped define. In response, President John F. Kennedy delivered his historic speech to Congress on May 25, 1961, declaring America's intention to land a man on the moon before the decade's end. The task of making that vision a reality fell squarely on the shoulders of von Braun and his Huntsville team. The Saturn V, their ultimate creation, was designed to lift an unprecedented payload into orbit, a rocket so powerful that it could carry not just weapons, but dreams. Meanwhile, Paperclip's operational secrecy began to erode. Journalists and congressional investigators started probing the program's hidden past. What they discovered shocked the public. Many of the scientists who had been portrayed as reluctant participants in the Nazi war effort were found to have held high-ranking positions within the regime's military-industrial hierarchy. Some had even been awarded SS ranks and had participated in decisions that cost thousands of lives. Yet by then, the narrative of redemption had already taken hold. The United States could not easily disown the men whose work had delivered its greatest victories. Despite the controversy, the practical results of Paperclip were undeniable. By the mid-1960s, American intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and space boosters derived directly from German designs. The Redstone family evolved into the Pershing and Thor systems, vital components of America's nuclear deterrent. In the private sector, the post-war technological explosion fed industries ranging from aerospace to pharmaceuticals. The scientists once hidden behind barbed wire in Texas were now professors, researchers, and citizens, their origins blurred by time and politics. In laboratories across the nation, the philosophy of engineering itself had changed. Wartime Germany's rigorous documentation methods, hierarchical project management, and obsessive testing culture had been absorbed into the DNA of American science. The United States became a superpower not only through its wealth, but through the systematic application of knowledge, a legacy that owed much to the very men it had once considered enemies. The same nation that had fought to destroy fascism now found itself thriving on the intellectual residue of its empire. And yet, even as America reached new heights, questions lingered beneath the surface. What did it mean that the most ambitious dream of humanity, to touch the stars, was built on a foundation of suffering and moral compromise? Could progress born of war ever truly be separated from the shadows that created it? These questions would begin to take center stage in the years to come, as truth and accountability slowly caught up with history's grandest experiment. By the late 1960s, the consequences of Operation Paperclip were finally beginning to surface in the public consciousness, as journalists, historians, and government investigators revisited the classified archives of the program. A different story emerged, one far removed from the clean narrative of scientific progress that had been carefully maintained for 2 decades. Documents revealed that many of the men brought to the United States had not been innocent bystanders of Nazi militarism. They had worn SS uniforms, attended Hitler's meetings, and overseen forced labor at facilities like Mittelwerk and Peenemünde. The files that once carried paperclips, marking them for clearance, had been deliberately altered to conceal their crimes. The revelation sent shockwaves through academia, politics, and moral philosophy alike. In 1973, the U.S. Department of Justice quietly began reviewing the immigration files of former paperclip scientists. The most infamous case was that of Arthur Rudolph, one of the key figures in the development of the Saturn V rocket. While hailed as an American hero for his technical contributions, Rudolph had also managed production at the Mittelwerk facility, where thousands of concentration camp prisoners died under his supervision. When confronted decades later, he admitted that he had known about the suffering but had done nothing to stop it. In 1984, under public pressure, Rudolph renounced his U.S. citizenship and left the country. His deportation marked one of the first acknowledgments that the moral cost of paperclip could not be permanently hidden. The reckoning did not stop there. Survivors of the Dora Mittelbau camp began to testify publicly, recounting the horrors of the underground, tunnels where men collapsed from exhaustion, beside the machines that built the V-2s. Their memories clashed with the televised image of von Braun smiling beside American astronauts. Museums and memorials in Germany began to record the other side of the story, the one that had been erased from the textbooks and newsreels. By the late 20th century, historians widely recognized that the technological miracle of the space age had been born from both brilliance and brutality. The juxtaposition was inescapable. Humanity's leap to the stars was paved with the suffering of those who never saw daylight. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, a different form of legacy unfolded. Most German scientists taken east under Operation Ossoaviakhim were eventually repatriated in the early 1950s, replaced by a generation of Soviet engineers trained under their guidance. By the time Yuri Gagarin orbited Earth in 1961, The German influence had faded from the Soviet program, but its technical fingerprints remained. The R-7 rocket, which launched Sputnik and Gagarin, carried the genetic code of Peenemunde's technology just as surely as America's Saturn V did. Both superpowers had inherited the same past. They had simply given it different uniforms. In the end, Paperclip left a paradox at the heart of modern history. The program undeniably accelerated human achievement. Without it, the United States might not have landed on the moon in 1969, nor developed advanced missile systems as quickly as it did. Yet the program also blurred the moral boundaries between justice and expedience. It showed that nations, even victorious ones, could bend their principles when the prize was great enough. The triumph of technology became inseparable from the tragedy of memory. By the dawn of the 21st century, the legacy of Paperclip had transformed from a military secret into a case study in ethical responsibility. Museums, documentaries, and declassified files forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. Progress often carries the weight of the past, and history's brilliance cannot be detached from its darkness. The men who came from Hitler's laboratories helped build a future that inspired billions, but their story remains a mirror, reflecting what humanity is capable of when ambition outpaces conscience. In the quiet corridors of history, Operation Paperclip stands as both a triumph and a warning. It reminds us that the pursuit of progress, when driven by fear and ambition, can blur the boundaries between justice and necessity. From the snowy mountains of Austria to the blazing deserts of New Mexico, the story of those scientists traces a line of human contradiction, one where genius and guilt coexist in the same breath. The rockets that once screamed through the skies of wartime Europe later carried men beyond Earth's atmosphere, transforming weapons of terror into vessels of discovery. Humanity's reach expanded, but so did its moral shadow. The success of Paperclip cannot be denied. It accelerated America's ascent to superpower status, ushered in the space age, and set in motion achievements that changed how the world understood science, power, and possibility. Yet beneath every milestone, every photograph of astronauts saluting the flag, every cheer that echoed from mission control, lay the ghosts of the past. The tunnels of Mittelwerk, the silent graves of forced laborers, and the quiet compromises of policymakers all lingered beneath the surface of victory. History's greatest paradox was not that former enemies became allies, but that their knowledge was embraced without their sins being fully reckoned with. In the decades that followed, the legacy of Operation Paperclip came to symbolize the moral complexity of modern civilization. It showed that progress is rarely pure, and that every leap forward comes with a shadow trailing behind. The same intellect that can build a bridge to the stars can also construct the machinery of destruction. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson, that technology, however magnificent, is only as moral as the hands that guide it. Today, when we look at the photographs of rockets lifting through the clouds, or at the footprints pressed into lunar dust, we are witnessing both the light of human achievement and the lingering twilight of its origins. The story of Paperclip endures not because it flatters us, but because it humbles us. It reminds the world that science, when untethered from conscience, can illuminate the heavens even as it darkens the human soul. In the end, the migration that changed the world did more than reshape nations. It forced humanity to confront the cost of its own ambition, and to ask whether the stars were ever worth the shadows that paved the way to them.